When you think of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you probably don't think of millionaires. The Soviet Union was, after all, a communist country built upon the ideals of economic equality. That said, human beings like to do their own thing, and getting rich in a country that you're not supposed to is hardly unimaginable. So did it ever happen? Were there any millionaires in the USSR, and if so, how did the people there react? So there are some difficulties in answering this question, since there were limitations on how money in the Soviet Union worked. For example, quantities of cars, toilet paper and foods were strictly controlled, and so getting more of these was reliant on political connections, not cash. And also, it's not like you could be so rich that you could retire early, since for most, lengthy unemployment was against the law. That said, if you had the political connections and the right job, you could live a pretty comfortable life, comparable to millionaires in the West. For example, many high-ranking ministers who served under Stalin had very little concept of money, since as government ministers they could ask for something and simply be brought it with no money leaving their pockets. One funny anecdote which demonstrates this is from when Stalin and his ministers were going for a walk around Moscow, and doing so they saw an old lady struggling to cross the road. Stalin helped her to cross and then wanted to give her some money to help her out. One problem though, neither Stalin nor his ministers carried any money with them since they never used it and the old lady got squat. Anyway, to answer the question as to whether or not there were any people who had the equivalent of $1 million openly in the USSR, the answer was yes, although it didn't happen until very late in its life. After Gorbachev had reformed the economy to allow some private enterprise, some people started to make a lot of money, particularly from importing luxury goods from the West. And one man who did this was Artem Tarazov, who in 1989 declared on television that he was the first person in the USSR to be worth millions of rubles, which wasn't millions in terms of US dollars, but given that for most Soviet citizens their yearly wage was between 1,500 and 3,000 rubles, it was a lot. So how did the Soviet people react? Well, very well, and they all congratulated Tarazov on "just kidding, they were outraged." Protests sprang up in major cities, politicians denounced the acquisition of capital on that scale, and many called for Tarazov to be imprisoned. His accounts were frozen and the KGB launched an investigation into him, but ultimately they found nothing, and so he was allowed to go back to his business, and soon after he became a millionaire in the traditional sense. Now, not a lot is known about Tarazov and his business, but what is certain is that his relations with the Soviet government were pretty awful, and it wasn't long until he fled the country and eventually settled in the UK. Despite all of this hubbub though, more and more Soviet citizens became wealthier and wealthier over the next 2 years. And when the USSR collapsed and many public assets were sold off, it was these people, mostly, who brought shares in them and whose wealth then subsequently exploded, giving some of the post-Soviet states the oligarchs that they're known for. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons: James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Marvin Cassow, Mo, Rob Waterhouse, James Castaneda, Jerry Lambdin, Gustav Swan, Aaron the White, Jordan Longley, Marcus Arsner, Charles I, Rashid Ali, Copper Tone, Maggie Paxkowski, Lexi Schwinn, Miss Izet, Matthew Shipley, Robert Wetzel, Spinning Three Plates, Spencer Lightfoot, Corshow Wolfe, Anthony Beckett and Winston Kaywood.